My career had always been my #1 priority, but one conversation behind closed doors changed everything. How could I have known that my boss would see me as more than just his assistant? That evening began like any other, a standard investor meeting in the company's sleek conference room. I focused on every detail, as I always did. My boss, Calvin Riley, a 45-year-old powerhouse in the industry, had a reputation for being both revered and feared. His black suit was as sharp as the man himself, and his cold blue eyes could cut through even the most polished professionals. As the meeting wrapped up, I began gathering my notes, trying not to look too closely at him. That was until his voice stopped me in my tracks. "Savannah, wait." I froze, clutching the folder in my hand. His tone wasn't loud, but it had a way of commanding absolute attention. I glanced up to see his eyes on me, not the typical impersonal look I was used to, but something more deliberate. "Yes, Mr. Riley, we need to talk," he said simply, motioning toward the door. The other executives had already left the room, leaving just the two of us in the spacious, glass-walled conference room. He walked over and, with a deliberate motion, shut the door behind me. The sound of the latch felt like the first drop in a roller coaster. I swallowed hard, unsure what to expect. My heart raced as he leaned casually against the edge of the table, his piercing gaze locked on me. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice low and calm. "Excuse me?" My pulse quickened. "You're different," he continued, his eyes trailing down slightly before snapping back to meet mine. "But there's something about you, something that's been distracting." My throat went dry. What did he mean by distracting? "I don't understand, Mr. Riley," I said, trying to sound composed, though my voice wavered slightly. His lips curved into a faint, almost predatory smile. "I think you do." He stood, taking a step toward me. My instinct told me to retreat, but I held my ground, clutching the folder like a shield. "This isn't appropriate," I managed to say, my voice firmer now. "Appropriate?" He tilted his head, his smile widening. "Savannah, when has doing what's appropriate ever gotten anyone ahead in life?" I couldn't tell if his words were meant to flatter or challenge me, or both. His presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an unspoken tension I couldn't ignore. "I think I should go," I said, starting to turn toward the door. Before I could take another step, he moved closer, his hand brushing the edge of the folder I held. His voice dropped to a near whisper. "Think about it, Savannah. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? 10? The question caught me off guard. Still fetching coffee and taking notes for someone else? Or do you want more?" His gaze bore into mine, and for a moment, I felt completely exposed. This isn't." I stumbled over my words, unable to form a coherent thought. He leaned in, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath. "I see potential in you, but potential means nothing if you're afraid to take risks." His words hung in the air like a dare, and I hated how they made my chest tighten. I didn't respond, afraid that anything I said would only feed into whatever game he was playing. "Go home," he said finally, stepping back and giving me just enough space to breathe again. "But think about what I've said." I didn't wait for another word. I practically fled the room, my heels clicking against the polished floor as I made my way to the elevator. The air outside the building felt cold against my flushed skin, but even then, I couldn't shake the way he'd looked at me, the way his words lingered. What was he trying to do? Was this some kind of test, or something far more dangerous? Little did I know, that conversation was only the beginning. What came next would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew about boundaries, ambition, and desire. And trust me, things are about to get a lot more complicated. The next morning, I walked into the office, determined to put the events of the previous night behind me. It had to have been a misunderstanding, I told myself, a misstep in a moment of tension. I buried myself in my tasks, focusing on emails and reports, hoping the busy work would quiet my mind. But I'd barely settled into my chair when the intercom on my desk buzzed. "Savannah, my office. Now." The calm authority in his voice made my heart skip a beat. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my notepad and walked down the corridor, trying to project an air of confidence. Inside, though, my stomach churned. When I reached his door, it was already open, as though he'd been waiting for me. "Close the door behind you," he said without looking up from his laptop. I hesitated for half a second before complying, the soft click of the latch echoing in the room. He motioned toward the chair in front of his desk without lifting his eyes. "Sit." I lowered myself into the chair, clutching my notepad like a lifeline. The room was filled with the faint scent of leather and cologne, a combination that made the air feel heavier. Finally, he looked up, folding his hands on the desk. His gaze was steady, unreadable, but there was an undercurrent of something deeper, something that made me feel as if he could see right through me. "Savannah, you've been with this company for what, 3 years?" "4," I corrected, my voice quieter than I intended. "4 years." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've done well. Better than well, actually. I've seen the way you handle pressure, how you anticipate problems before they arise. You're sharp, driven." "Thank you," I said cautiously, unsure of where this was going. "But," he continued, leaning forward now, "there's one thing holding you back." I froze, my pulse quickening. "And what's that?" He smiled faintly, a calculated expression that felt both reassuring and predatory. "You play it too safe. You do what's expected, no more, no less. You're comfortable in the box you've built for yourself." I'm not sure I understand." His smile widened slightly, and he stood, walking around to the front of his desk. He leaned against it, close enough that I could feel the heat of his presence. "You're capable of so much more, Savannah," he said, his tone softer now. "But success, real success, requires risk. Stepping out of the comfort zone. Doing what others won't." I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm saying," he began, leaning down so that our faces were almost level, "that I can take you further than you've ever dreamed. But it requires a certain understanding between us." The words hung in the air like a challenge. My heart pounded as I struggled to interpret his meaning. "I don't think He held up a hand, silencing me. "Think about it. I'm not asking for an answer right now. But you should know this. The choices you make in moments like this define your future. What kind of woman do you want to be?" I stared at him, my mind racing. Was this a test? A trap? Or something else entirely? "Take the day," he said, straightening up and stepping back toward his chair. "Consider your options carefully. But understand this, Savannah, nothing worth having comes without a price." I stood on shaky legs, gripping my notepad tightly. His gaze followed me to the door, and as I stepped into the hallway, I felt as if I'd escaped a pressure chamber. All day, his words replayed in my mind. What did he mean by a certain understanding? Was this about my career, or something far more personal? As I sat at my desk, trying to focus on my work, I caught his reflection in the glass wall of his office. He was watching me, his expression unreadable. The knot in my stomach tightened. This wasn't over, not even close. And deep down, I knew, whatever came next would either break me, or change everything forever. I spent the next few days avoiding him. I kept my head down, focusing on emails, reports, and any mundane task I could find. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore the tension that seemed to grow thicker every time I stepped into the office. His presence was inescapable. I'd catch glimpses of him through the glass walls of his office, his gaze steady and deliberate whenever our eyes accidentally met. My pulse quickened every time, and I hated how much it affected me. By Friday evening, most of the staff had left for the weekend. The office was unusually quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights the only sound. I was packing up my things when the intercom buzzed. "Savannah, my office." The knot in my stomach tightened. I hesitated, staring at the intercom as if it might start speaking again. Part of me wanted to ignore the summons, but I knew that wasn't an option. I made my way down the hall, my footsteps soft against the carpet. His office door was slightly ajar, as though he'd been expecting me. I pushed it open cautiously and stepped inside. "Close the door," he said without looking up from the document in his hand. I complied, the sound of the door clicking shut sending a chill down my spine. He finally looked up, his sharp blue eyes locking onto mine. "Sit." I sank into the chair across from him, trying to keep my expression neutral. "Have you thought about what I said?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a hint of impatience that hadn't been there before. "I have," I said carefully, my hands folded in my lap. "And I don't think it's right." His lips twitched, as if he was suppressing a smile. "Right?" He leaned back in his chair, studying me like a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Savannah, doing what's right is for people content with mediocrity. We're not those people." I felt my resolve waver under the weight of his gaze. "I'm not sure what you're implying." "You know exactly what I'm implying," he interrupted, leaning forward. "You're smart, ambitious. You understand that success isn't handed out to people who play it safe." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. He stood and moved around the desk, coming to stand just a few feet from me. "I could show you," he said, his voice softer now, almost coaxing. "What I mean." I pushed back slightly in my chair, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Mr. Riley, this isn't." "Calvin," he corrected, his tone firm. Let's drop the formalities. He stepped closer, and instinctively, I rose from the chair, putting a small but crucial amount of space between us. This is crossing a line, I said, my voice trembling. A professional line. Lines are arbitrary, he said, taking another step toward me. They're only there until someone decides to move them. Haven't you ever wanted to push boundaries, Savannah? To see what's on the other side? I took a step back, but the room felt smaller than it had a moment ago. Calvin, I don't think. You don't have to think. His voice was low now, almost a whisper. Just listen to what you're feeling. I wanted to protest, to say something that would put an end to whatever this was. But my words caught in my throat as he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my shoulder. Savannah, he said, his tone soft but insistent. I'm not forcing you, but don't pretend you don't feel it too. The warmth of his touch sent a shock through me, and for a moment, I couldn't move. My mind raced, a storm of conflicting emotions tearing through me. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that this was inappropriate, that I wasn't that kind of person. But a small, treacherous part of me, the part that remembered the way his eyes lingered on me, the way his voice made my skin prickle, couldn't deny the truth. I need to go, I said finally, stepping away from him. His hand dropped to his side, but he didn't move back. Instead, he watched me, his expression unreadable. I'll let you go, he said quietly, but I want you to think about something. I turned toward the door, desperate to escape. You keep saying this isn't right, he continued, his voice stopping me in my tracks. But tell me this, what's holding you back? Fear? Morality? Or something else entirely? I didn't answer. I couldn't. I pushed open the door and stepped into the hallway, my heart pounding as I made my way back to my desk. As I gathered my things, his words echoed in my mind. What's holding you back? I wanted to believe it was my principles, my professionalism, but the truth was messier than that, tangled up in emotions I didn't want to admit to myself. That night, as I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, his voice, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered in the world. The lines between us weren't just blurred anymore. They were disappearing entirely, and the most terrifying part was, I wasn't sure I wanted to redraw them. That evening, I drove home, determined to clear my head. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the memory of him, his voice, his gaze, his proximity. The way he spoke, so sure of himself, so confident in his ability to pull me into his world. I tried to distract myself, flipping through shows on TV, scrolling through my phone, even attempting to read a book. None of it worked. My thoughts always circled back to him, to the unspoken tension between us, to the way his words lingered long after he'd said them. The next morning, I resolved to end it. Whatever game Calvin Riley was playing, I wasn't going to be a part of it. I wasn't that person, couldn't be that person. By the time I arrived at the office, my resolve felt solid. I would confront him, draw a clear line, and move forward. This was my career, my life, and I wasn't going to let him derail it. I marched to his office, my heels clicking against the floor with determined finality. His door was open, as if he'd been waiting for me. Savannah, he greeted me, his voice calm but carrying that unmistakable undertone of control. Come in. I stepped inside, ignoring the way my pulse quickened as he closed the door behind me. We need to talk, I said, my voice firm, though my heart was racing. He raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against the edge of his desk. About? You know what this is about, I replied, crossing my arms. This thing between us. It has to stop. He tilted his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Thing? Don't play dumb, Calvin, I snapped, the words escaping before I could stop them. You've been crossing boundaries, and it's inappropriate. It needs to end. He straightened, stepping toward me. If that's how you feel, he said, his voice low and deliberate, then why are you here? The question caught me off guard. I'm here to make it clear. No, he interrupted, his gaze locking onto mine. Why are you here? I faltered, my breath hitching as he closed the space between us. His eyes bore into mine, as though he could see straight through the layers of professionalism and resolve I'd wrapped around myself. I don't think you came here to end this, he continued, his voice soft but insistent. I think you came here because you're just as drawn to this as I am. That's not true, I said, but the words lacked conviction. Isn't it? He reached out, his fingers brushing against my hand. The touch was light, almost imperceptible, but it sent a wave of heat through me. I took a step back, but he followed, closing the distance again. If you want me to stop, Savannah, just say the word, he murmured. Tell me right now, and I'll never bring this up again. I opened my mouth, ready to say it, but the words wouldn't come. His hand moved to my arm, the warmth of his touch radiating through the thin fabric of my blouse. "Say it," he whispered, his breath grazing my ear. "And this ends here." The room felt smaller, the air heavier. I wanted to tell him to stop, to walk away, to leave me alone. But my body betrayed me, frozen under the weight of his presence. The word hung in the air, unfinished, as he pulled back just enough to meet my eyes again. "You can't say it, can you?" His smile was faint but triumphant, his voice filled with quiet certainty. I hated how right he was, hated how my silence spoke louder than any words I could have said. "I should go," I said finally, stepping away from him and toward the door. He didn't stop me this time. He didn't need to. "Think about what you really want, Savannah," he said as I opened the door. "And be honest with yourself, for once." The door clicked shut behind me, but his words lingered, echoing in my mind as I returned to my desk. I stared blankly at my computer screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard but unable to type. I wanted to believe I'd done the right thing by walking away. But the truth was, I didn't feel like I'd ended anything. If anything, the tension between us had only grown stronger, pulling me toward a precipice I wasn't sure I could avoid. That night, as I lay in bed, his voice haunted me. The way he said my name, the way he challenged me to confront my own desires, it was maddening. I replayed the moment over and over, wishing I'd said something different, done something different. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because for all my protests, all my attempts to hold on to control, a part of me wanted this, wanted him. And that terrified me more than anything else. The weight of everything, our unspoken tension, the boundaries I swore I wouldn't cross, the carefully constructed walls I'd built around myself, collapsed in an instant. All the rules, all the lines, all the reasons why this was wrong dissolved into the air around us, leaving just the two of us in the dimly lit office. His presence was overwhelming, and I felt myself drawn into the moment despite my better judgment. "Savannah," he murmured against my lips, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me if this is too much." I didn't answer. Instead, I kissed him back, deeper this time, my hands finding their way to his chest. The rational part of me screamed that this was a mistake, but the rest of me didn't care. He guided me to the couch, and every movement felt deliberate, as though he was giving me time to stop him. I could feel the tension in him, the restraint he was holding on to, but I didn't want him to hold back. Somewhere in the haze, the sound of a notification buzzed faintly from my phone on his desk, but it was like a distant echo in a world that no longer mattered. Afterward, I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling. My breathing was still uneven, and my mind raced to piece together what had just happened. Calvin sat beside me, his shirt unbuttoned, watching me with a look I couldn't quite decipher. "Are you okay?" he asked, breaking the silence. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I was answering him or convincing myself. "This doesn't have to change anything," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Unless you want it to." I turned to look at him, searching his face for answers. He seemed so sure, so composed, as though this was just another calculated move in his perfectly ordered life. "I don't know what I want," I admitted. His lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "That's okay. Take your time." He stood and began buttoning his shirt, his movements unhurried. "You should go home. Get some rest." I sat up, pulling my blouse back into place, the reality of what had just happened beginning to settle over me. As I reached for my bag, he stopped me. "Savannah," he said, his tone softer now. I looked up, my heart skipping a beat. "We're going to be okay." The next morning, I arrived at the office early, hoping to avoid him. I needed time to think, to figure out how to navigate the aftermath of what we'd done. But when I stepped inside, I found him already there, seated at his desk with a coffee in hand. His eyes met mine the moment I entered, and my stomach flipped. For a second, I thought he might call me into his office, but he didn't. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and returned his attention to his computer. The day passed in a blur. Every time I saw him, I felt a mixture of guilt, excitement, and something else I couldn't quite name. I wondered if the others in the office could sense the shift between us, if they noticed the stolen glances, the way I avoided meeting his gaze for too long. At lunchtime, as I sat alone in the break room, my phone buzzed with a message. "Calvin, are you free after work? We should talk." My fingers hovered over the screen, uncertain how to respond. But before I could type anything, another message came through. "Calvin, unless you're afraid of what this could mean for us." The challenge in his words was clear, and I hated how much it made my heart race. That evening, I found myself back in his office. The lights were dim, the city skyline glowing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He stood by the window, his hands in his pockets, his posture relaxed yet commanding. "You came," he said without turning around. "You didn't give me much of a choice," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. He turned to face me, a faint smile on his lips. "There's always a choice, Savannah." I crossed my arms, bracing myself for whatever he was about to say. "So, talk." He stepped closer, his gaze unwavering. "I meant what I said last night. This doesn't have to change anything, unless you want it to. And if I don't know what I want, then let me make it simple," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "I want you. Not just for last night, not just for the moments we steal behind closed doors. I want more." My breath caught. I wasn't sure what I'd expected him to say, but it wasn't this. "This is insane," I said, shaking my head. "You're my boss. This could ruin both of us. Or it could be the best thing that's ever happened to us," he countered. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stepped back, giving me space. "Think about it," he said. "Really think about it. And when you're ready, you know where to find me." As I walked out of his office, my mind was a whirlwind of emotions. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. The line we'd crossed wasn't just a one-time mistake. It was the start of something far more complicated, far more dangerous. And as much as I tried to convince myself otherwise, I wasn't sure I wanted to go back. But what would you do in my place? Would you walk away from the tension, the thrill, the promise of something more? Or would you step into the unknown, knowing it could cost you everything?